Hey everyone, my name is Jesse. I am the author and designer of this game, The Legends of the Hidden Ones TTRPG. And today we're just going to go over the background and history of the universe that this game is set in, just to give your game some foundations before we go on to character creation, rules, and things like that. So, the Legends of the Hidden Ones universe is our current universe. Earth exists. It can be today. It can be 500 years in the past. It can be 1,000 years in the future. Whatever you want. But this is a sci-fantasy game, is how I would classify it. Quick notes before we get into this. The only playable races are human. Humans can change their looks, obviously, as we'll get into with Gen 4 and shapeshifting and things like that. But no matter what, the genome and actual soul of a creature is human, which is actually the second point, the second important thing to note before getting into this game, is that souls do exist. There is a spiritual or astral plane. I like the astral realm or astral plane, whatever you want to call it. Existence of where the soul is. The soul is not only what holds the magical force of a being, but is also what makes a human. Animals have lesser souls, I guess you could say, and is why controllers, and this gets onto the third point of what is not allowed by magic, controllers cannot create life, which deals with resurrection and things. If you can bind a soul to the body and make them only mostly dead using certain Gen 4 powers, then you can revive them by holding the soul in the body. But once the soul is departed, there's no way to recreate it or get it back. Additionally, controllers can generate flesh but cannot imbue that flesh with life. So no, unfortunately, animal creation or metaphysical magics like soul jarring and things like that. The other things that aren't permissible are time travel and mind control. Minor telepathy abilities are legal, but there is no ability to 100% mind control someone. So, anyway, those few things out of the way, let's get into the story of this world. There was a man, early human, named, we'll call him Joe, and he found some primordial elements that, when consumed by him, unbound his soul from this physical dimension and pushed him bodily into essentially the astral plane, so to speak. And he found out that time is actually, everyone has an individual time strand. They weave together in a single flow of time. Whether that loops back on itself by some sort of causal loop or paradox is completely valid. He found some of those. But also, it flows on forever, apparently. And once he'd learned this, he figured out quickly how to move on that, how to pop back into this reality and back out and begin to change things. Those changes led to a multiverse because every change spawned more changes that diversified from the original timeline, and an infinite multiverse was created. Now, keep in mind that this entire game is based on a paradox. How you use that in your game is up to you. And the paradox is this. Eventually, he found out that he would become a despot. And to prevent that from happening, he went back in time with a powerful pesticide, and one of the elements that, or one of the ingredients, was a early form of a berry bush that didn't have seeds yet, but created much like a creeper, like a strawberry vine, or potatoes do, where they don't actually have seeds, they just send out tubers and roots. And using this pesticide and just eating the berries, because they were seedless, prevented himself from ever time traveling. That paradox kicked in one of the physical phenomena, physical laws, which is matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, only change forms, and the infinite universe collapsed on itself because time travel never having happened, even though, and that's the paradox, it created all of the energy and all of the futures, and yet once those were created, they couldn't be undone. They could be unmade, but the energy and life and matter that was in them couldn't be unmade. All of the matter was instantly converted to energy, and those energies coalesced into three infinite spheres. One of life and energy, and all of the matter transmuted to energy that never was. One of all the death, decay, entropy, endings that never were. That is Darkfire. The first is the electromotive or electromagnetic power, which in this game is just called electricity. And the third was of all the change that never happened, and that was a sphere of gravity power. From that collection, there were sparks. That's known as the collection of the infinite spheres by the wise. From that collection, sparks rain down across all of these time strands, empowering human souls and, to a smaller degree, creature souls. And from there, controllers were born with the ability to manipulate various aspects of the physical world. 500 years after the first controllers were created at that time in the past, they had figured out how to travel through the stars. They did this in small teams with light controller or an electric controller, preventing highly energized rays from radiation, things like that, from hurting the team. Life was sustained by nature, earth, and usually a water controller, although they aren't 100% necessary for that, and a gravity controller for travel. And these teams would then seek out throughout the galaxy and eventually the universe to find planets to populate. After that, the empires began to be set up. As those explorers began to colonize, they not only began to create the actual classes of power, as controllers learned to specialize in how they use their power, whether that be for actual spell casting, for healing, to empower themselves, to allow them to bond with powered technology to create super-powered cyborgs, things of that nature. Not only did they do that, but they also had idealized ways of living, and these became the empires. Now, there are 6 overarching empires with lots of smaller domains within each one. The human is technically, as you can see at the top, it is technically the most important, and is the empire Earth is actually involved in. Meta gamingly, the idea behind this game is that all of our legends, whether it be of Superman or Green Lantern, who was just a light controller, a witch, which was just a nature controller, all of those legends come from being actually, our planet is in this universe, and we have just caught glimpses of what's out there. That is the human empire, and it is the most powerful. We'll talk about that in a moment after we understand why it exists. The Grey Empire is ruled over by the Rogue King, who is the master of gravity and the gravity eternal. The infinite spheres, I forgot to mention, only link to one person at a time in each timeline, and that person has access to varying degrees of the infinite sphere. Only once ever did all 3 Eternals ever have access to the full might or the infinite power of each sphere, but at a time there will only ever be one gravity, one electric, and one dark fire Eternal existing. And because the gravity Eternal conceptually has power over change, he himself does not change, and so whether the face or the body changes, the soul and how it interacts with everything else does not change, but is instead transferred from body to body by essentially the conceptualization of an infinite sphere. He rules the Grey Empire and used his teleportation power to give not only preeminence in the military by being able to teleport his armies wherever you are, which means no matter how strategically you place yourself, he is always going to have a better time than you are, but also by creating the best economy through the creation of the hub network, which are essentially space station / airports, so you have full amenities on them, but they are full of warp rings, which are gem-created teleportation gates, essentially, a little bit like a cross between like a Stargate and a teleportation circle from D&D, to where you can just step through one and out another, and you have teleported to that place. And the way this hub network works is you have a warp gate on a planet, and it attaches to a hub. The hub has warp gates connecting to however many places it wants in within the Grey Empire or outside. They can be hired out, and you travel via the hub network. It makes transportation costs incredibly low, as well as mobility throughout the empire incredibly easy. And so, for that reason, the Grey Empire is usually the most sought after empire to join if a new nation colonizes, and it does not attack. The Grey Empire is not offensive in its uh, ability to gain new territories and things of that nature. It simply allows free join and leaving, and law-wise is very, very relaxed, very loose, enforcing only basic property rights and things of that nature, just to make sure that no one oppresses another openly. There are always things that get away from that, but overall, it's a pretty free empire, allowing free join, and is the largest because of its military and economic policies. Next up is the second most powerful empire, the Khodal Empire, which is a bunch of controllers that figured out they're really good at fighting and decided to find all of the essentially non-resource abundant planets, either planets that get left behind by the Mech Empire or just planets that are in good locations, have access to a few hubs at the same time. And they set up a series of honor codes, families, whatever you want. That's why they're called the Khodal, because their society is built on mercenary guilds, essentially. They hire out, each guild has its own set of codes, what it will do, how much it costs, but they are a system of mercenaries. Each is free until war comes, at which point they have an elected high command that will coordinate the best fighters in the universe. No one wants to fight them, especially when most high-level officials are protected by at least one Khodal, or there's a Khodal in the area. War against the Khodal Empire would pretty much mean your entire high-level command structure is just decimated within 5 minutes of the command going out. So no one fights the Khodal, but they also have their own rules. Each little family or code is allowed to create its own rules. Disputes are settled by those of the largest age, as they have obviously survived the most battles being in that society. And they hire out as mercenaries. It's a nation of, or an empire of mercenaries. Next, we can talk about the Hive, which is a loosely linked telepathic society bred from, as you can see on the screen, bred from the legends of the god city Eliatham, which is where we get our idea of Elysium. Eliatham, we can go into more details later, but it was a city that was connected by the perfected hive mind spell, with about 100,000 controllers acting as a single unit, creating a planetary city that was more powerful than all but an Eternal, and even more powerful than some Eternals have been in history. Once that city broke down due to mistrust and misuse, a bastardized version of that spell that kept it all linked, the hive mind spell, it's called the common hive mind now, was used to create the hive, with essentially high levels having no one to talk down to them, and those at the lowest levels of society having everyone talk down to them, and so it can be very mentally suppressive. But they function as a hive mind society, and as such are gaining in power, but their growth is very slow, as they have to set up universities to power the spell on each new territory they conquer. Next, the Mecha Empire is an empire built on technologies. Some controllers did not want to work very hard, and so a combination of earth and electric controllers figured out how to create incredibly advanced AI, and using that, built an empire on it. They have mass mech armies, which, although not the most effective at all-out and out war, being that a powerful earth controller with a snap can destroy an entire mech army, that leaves them a little high and dry in all-out warfare, but they tend to strip mine planets of earth materials, forge them into their armies, and leave the planet behind to be taken over by the Khodal, the Hive, or the Lestarians, depending on who's the nearest. One of the biggest benefits of the Mech Empire is because they are so research focused and machine based. They're always trying to improve their machines. They have the best studies. Specialized abilities and spells can come out of the other empires, but if you want magic or technological advancement, the Mech Empire is the way to go. Last but not least of the normal empires are the Lestarians. These are a fringe group of planets that are not linked by a teleportation hub. They are all within 3 clustered galaxies that the Lestarians have set up their own teleports within. And they are nature and the physical realm worshipping controllers who decided that the environment is all there is, and so basically morphed themselves into animaline shapes to better suit their worship of nature, carved out their own little empire, and since they do not use technology and are 100% anarchistic, they have no real military might other than everyone attack that guy, which doesn't work very well, so all the other empires basically just ignore them as a fringe group of pseudo-religious empire. They leave them to their own galaxies. Occasionally the Lestarians will expand to an unoccupied or weakly defended planet from usually the Grey Empire, because the Grey Empire doesn't really care what happens on its fringes. And so if they do expand, it's through that. It's through several gravity controllers setting up a warp to a new planet and then just en masse wiping it out. Last but not least is the Human Empire, and this is the most important empire, as I said, because of the fact that for an unknown reason, controllers are most likely to be born in a place where no controllers exist. It's a strange thing, but the higher the population of controllers in the area, the fewer controllers are born there. So the other empires needing controllers to maintain their power essentially created an empire, and leave alone an empire of planets that are entirely human, who do not know that there is an outside world. They also will occasionally come here in secret and just kind of moonlight around to see what it's like to live so primitively. But they leave these planets alone, and when a child is born that is a controller, it usually lightly manifests at the age of 3 or 4, but around 11 or 12 it fully manifests, and at that point they are, if the essentially baby snatchers are nice, they will talk to the parents. Usually most empires pull a Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan and just take the kid from the parents, either with compensation or at least with the parents' knowledge of what's going on. Some just baby nap them. The best ones will offer to relocate the parents, allow them to come see their child while they're trained for whichever empire the child is joining. And the Human Empire functions as a battery for all of the other empires. There are small networks. The idea of a coven actually comes from the most famous, or largest, not necessarily the most famous as it's relatively unknown, but the largest coven calls itself the Dark Blood Coven, and it's led by a Darkfire matriarch at all times. And it's a essentially system of female controllers who prevent children from being kidnapped. If the parents would allow the children to leave, the coven will leave it alone, but the idea of a coven comes from these groups of female controllers that stay hidden on human planets. They're very small, because would they be allowed to get larger, they would reduce human populations, but the other empires know there's not much they can do about it, so they leave them as small groups, and try to prevent child napping in these other empires. That is pretty much the background and setting of the game. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is creatures and how magic interacts with creatures. Creatures aren't like humans. They don't consciously use magic. It's when a creature is of a kind that has been hit by a spark, they gain magical abilities, but they use their magic instinctively. Excuse me. They use their magic instinctively, which allows them to create effects that humans wouldn't normally be able to do. Take a Varkalak, for example. They can use electric and dark fire powers. Not something a human could do, unless you're a specific brand of Idex, because they are not casting magic with their mind. They're casting it based on their instinct and what they want to happen. So if you run into a creature that has an effect that is just not accessible by a player, that is why. So that is the end of kind of the lore of this world. Next, we'll be talking about character sheets, character creation. After that, we'll go over the rules, and then we'll get into the fun stuff of class and elements. So I will see you all then. Peace.